the Catholics who came to Kentucky, and there was no Catholic priest. It was the early days, it was very much mission time. And the Catholics in the area wrote a letter to the bishop, I believe in Indiana, and asked for a priest to be sent. And the priest that volunteered was Father Theodore Baden, and then was the first Catholic priest ordained in the United States. The rest had been ordained in Europe and came over. Father Baden, if you read through the book, the history of St. Francis de Sales, was a rather tough old guy, and he was very rigorous in his moral teachings. He was known to refuse absolution to penitents if they didn't swear off dancing. It was in 1820 that this church was built. Before that, had been a log cabin church across the road. I don't know exactly where, but I do know it was across the road somewhere near the cemetery. The architect, I'm told, was Dutch, and you can tell that from the particular pattern in the brickwork. And interestingly enough, with the church tower, you can see a Bavarian influence, in that the church towers in Bavaria have kind of an onion dome shape to them, which is unique to Bavaria for Catholic churches. And so we have those influences. It was about 3 or 4 years ago that earlier Bishop Gaynor had offered the possibility of my community coming here to use this church. At that time, it was just used for Mass 1 day a week, and the rest of the time it stood empty. And so we needed a home for our community, and he offered this to us. Before I had accepted, I wanted to have the church looked at, so I brought in a structural engineer. We looked at the place and said, it's nothing major. And fortunately, there were some major things, but fortunately his firm had done some work earlier, and we had a lot of the structural things that needed to be done already been begun to examine. And so we made the decision to come here, and they sold off all but 20 acres, and that is what paid for the renovations of the church.
So you had to sell.
Because I'm certainly not going to farm the land.
So a lot of the priests were expected to farm the land in order to support the church. Is that
Well, no, it wasn't the priests that were expected to farm the land. The families of the parish were.
Oh, okay.
And the priests sometimes just let them do things on their own, and sometimes wanted to run the place and direct things. And they were taught to be theologians, they were not taught to be farmers. The other thing is, unless you had someone to kind of organize and push, they had their own farms to work. So there was always a certain tension that went on with this as well.
Some of the other items we see in the church, such as the statues and then on the altar, do you mind to talk about the history of those again?
Before we start with the statues, part of the history is the church. The Sisters of the Visitation came. It was an order started by St. Jane Francis de Chantal. And it was an order specifically for older women or for women who, it was not as, the orders had been very much monastic for women. And they would go out and visit the sick and help the poor, and that's why they were called the Sisters of the Visitation. Later they became cloistered, which means they had to live in they couldn't go out as they used to. But the order was founded by St. Jean de Francis de Chantal and St. Francis de Sales together. And one of the things, when the order kind of had this put into two different groups. One was more contemplative, and the other ran schools for girls. And the part that has the schools for girls came here to Kentucky, and they had a school here on the property. Now, they were starting to grow, become well known, and they needed to expand. And that's where the Cardone Center arose. They left the property here and built up their school there. The Cardone Center, or the Cardone School, was quite famous, but the sisters closed down, and the statues in the church basically were warehoused. Statue of St. Francis de Sales, St. Patrick, Sacred Heart, the Adoring Angels. If you look at old photos of the Cardone Center, the chapel, you'll see them in there. Now, the statues, as the church was not being used here, they were kind of a warehouse. The only statue that I'm sure is original is up in the top corner. You'll see a statue of Pope St. Pius V. Okay. And originally, as a mission, or as the original church was named St. Francis de Sales. But the Dominicans came and took over the parish, and at that time the name of the parish changed to Pius V, who was a Dominican saint.
Do you mind to talk a little bit about the altar?
The altar is beautiful work. It was a painter named Johann Schmidt. Johann Schmidt studied in Germany, probably at the Royal Arts School in Bavaria. As you can see, a lot of if you look at the painting, it's very typical of that painting style of that school. And he came over to the United States and then down to Cincinnati and then to Kentucky, and lived in Kentucky. And there he painted quite a few churches for the Diocese of Covington and the Diocese of Cincinnati. Beautiful artwork. And so this is one of his works. It was restored, but you can see the original work. This is very dark style, typical of the German work. The altar itself had been in bad shape. You see the little things sticking out of the spires on the top, they're called crockets. And those were originally made of plastic. And so you only had to bump them slightly and the thing would fall off. So we're very fortunate. There was another fellow here, Andrew Willard, who grew up in this parish and looked at it all these years saying, I wish I could do something about that. Well, he had his chance. A lot of the wood over the years had broken. It was very brittle. Some pieces had to be recarved. He was also skilled in painting. When we took off the paint, we found it had been repainted a couple times, sadly. First with the blue, then with the white. But when you got up under all of that, you got back to the original colors. And we tried to match those as much as we could. There's an old photo I found of the church, and you can see it was painted much as we have it now. And he did the marbleizing on the painting and did a magnificent job. From a distance, you think that's marble, but it's all painted wood.
One thing, well, there were two things that I didn't get a chance to find in research or anything, and that is the stained glass work. I don't know if you have any information on that.
Yeah, the stained glass work was probably done about the same time, 1800s.
Oh, wow.
I spoke with the stained glass artist who redid the work, windows at St. Peter's. Brought him up here to see if he'd be interested because the windows needed to be redone. You could see where people had tried to wash them and the stain was coming off. And it was like what I thought, was it painted or what? And he explained at that period in time, the windows here are quite common, and they were literally putting out millions of feet of stained glass at the time. And what they would do is use a silk screen process on the glass, and then they would fire it, but they would lay them up on different levels. And so the pieces that were on the bottom got fired at the proper temperature, but the pieces up on top didn't get enough heat, so the stain didn't sink into the glass as it ought to have. So one of the things that they had to do with the repair of the windows was Ziegler Glass in Paris went and redid the pieces where the stain was coming off. They cleaned it, re-leaded it, and it's just beautiful. It's really beautiful now. Much more light coming in. It's really great. Yeah. Some of the interesting things you'll find in the church, if you look at the pews, you'll see they have doors on them.
Yes.
And the reason for that is that one of the ways of raising money in earlier times was what they called pew rent, where your family could rent the pew for a year, and it would be your family's pew. You would get the key. See, there's a keyhole here.
The paintings here, are those more recent, or are they also?
All I can tell you is they have been repainted.
Is there anything about the building or the grounds that we should know about that we haven't talked about yet?
The choir loft, we think, was probably not original. It was probably built on after the church was constructed. And the reason for that, we believe that, is we found that the back of the choir loft was barely attached to the wall.
Indicated something.
Yes. There were some interesting things during the renovations that we found. We didn't realize just how out of true these columns were. At some point in history, someone took out the cross beams that were above. And they were, of course, there to keep the sides from going out. Someone took them out. And so over the years, the weight of the roof began pushing out the walls and the columns. But no one saw this because the bricks were repointed and you couldn't see the cracks. We find there was as much as 12 to 14 inches variation from start to end. So we had to put in the tie rods to stabilize them. Another thing that had happened is somewhere in history there had been a plaster ceiling. And for whatever reason they took it down. It may have been that it just needed work and there wasn't much money to replace it. And they had these large pieces of drop pipe, these rather biggies. And that had been there for many years. And one of the things we did with the renovation was to put the ceiling back to its original design, which really brought the acoustics in this church to life.
Yeah.
Tremendous acoustics. And you've got this wonderful art, the wonderful curves, and so it's just a really great acoustics. And it's a much more beautiful ceiling now. But yeah, outside the church, you'll see there's a cross out there with the names of sisters, and that is a rather sad chapter in some ways. When the city of Georgetown took over the Cardone Center, one of the things they did was disinter the nuns because it was going to be city property. And so by that time, most of the coffins had disintegrated and it was just dirt. So that's why you see the sisters that are buried there.
So they're not in the cemetery there, they're actually...
No, the sisters are buried off to the side. You'll see the cross. You won't see actual graves. It's just dirt that was done. Anyways, on the renovation itself, it was the company that was hired to do their renovation was Woodford Builders. And I have to say they did a magnificent job. They worked very hard. I've dealt with builders in the past, and these far excel any builders I've ever worked with. Maureen Pearson was the architect who worked with us, and so we continue to work with the structural engineer and the architect to deal with all the problems of structural issues and foundational issues, so that this church would be good for another 200 years. They rewired the entire place because the wiring was very unsafe. The bell tower was ready to fall down. And you'll see from some of the photos that twisted, horrible shape. And we wanted to preserve the quality of the original building. There were things that had to change for building code. For example, one of the exterior doors, we had to raise it for the building code. And the wiring had to be changed. A few other things. But as much as we could, we wanted to keep it to the original. Because it is a gem.
I'd like to talk just a little bit about the cemetery.
Yeah, well, that I don't have as much knowledge of. The cemetery, I don't know if I mentioned it before, had been let go of over the years as people stopped coming here. There was no one that was taking care of the cemetery. The cemetery goes back to the original church. There are people who fought in the Revolutionary War buried in that cemetery. You see the original immigrants. There are slaves that are buried there as well. And most recently, St. John's had a company do the, what do they call LiDAR, where they do the ground mapping radar, to get an accurate portrait of who was buried where, because some of the slaves were just buried and there was just a field stone quite often. Also, there was a number of times some people were buried and records weren't necessarily kept.
Oh, okay. I would not have thought of that.
Yeah.
Cemeteries are fascinating places to explore. Not only do they remind you of eternal things, but they also give you a good sense of local history. You see the names of famous people. You see the names of people who are not so famous. You see relationships. You see husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, aunts, and uncles. You see the dates. You also see the headstones. The headstones in themselves are fascinating. The symbols there. There's a lot of text chiseled into those headstones. You have fond memories. You have fond wishes. You have prayers for the dead. We're at the St. Francis Cemetery, directly across from St. Francis Church, 9 miles west of Georgetown, Kentucky. Here at St. Francis Cemetery, we have over 200 people buried here, and a good number of them lived and died in the 18th and 19th century. I want to show you some of these people. I want to show you some of the vets from different wars. I want to show you the founders, movers and shakers of this parish. And then finally, I want to show you some more interesting parishioners at St. Francis Cemetery. Come along. Our first veteran is Robert Lee. He was born in 1793 and died in 1877. And he is a veteran of the War of 1812. His family originally is from Virginia, and yes, this is the same family that produced General Robert E. Lee. Now, let's go on to our next veteran. Bennett Greenwald is a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He was born in 1761 and died in 1838. Now, he is from Maryland, and a lot of the people here in this cemetery are from Maryland. Maryland was originally settled as a Catholic colony to let them worship as they please. But later on, over the years, there was persecution of Catholics in Maryland. So beginning in 1785, a group of Catholics migrated westward, and some of them came through Kentucky. In fact, quite a few came through Kentucky, and a lot of them stopped and settled here. Our second Revolutionary War veteran is James Twyman. He was born in 1761 and died in 1834. If you notice, here at the base of his headstone is a plaque. Every Revolutionary War veteran gets a plaque from the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution. They do the research and determine if the person is indeed a veteran of the Revolutionary War. Cornelius Fenwick was born in 1763 and died in 1856. Now you'll notice there is not a plaque for him for being a Revolutionary War veteran. That's because the DAR has not decided if he is indeed a Revolutionary War veteran. However, there is evidence that I've seen that he is. So hopefully someday he'll get a plaque from the DAR. Not only was Jeremiah Tarleton a Revolutionary War veteran, he was also a founder, a major mover and shaker here at this parish, St. Francis. He was the richest man in the parish. He was the largest landowner in northwestern Scott County. He did other things too. He had a tavern just west of here, which is now a private residence. He was also Justice of the Peace. He was the county sheriff, and he was the fellow who provided the land for the first chapel, which was basically a log cabin. James Goff was another founder of this parish. He was born in 1755 and died in 1826. And like so many, he was from Maryland. He was also a very rich man. And one of the unique things about James Goff is that he was related to 1/3 of his parish. And as you can see, all these headstones are Goff headstones. There are a lot of interesting parishioners buried here at St. Francis Cemetery, and one of them is this gentleman, Keane O'Hara. He was from Ireland. He was born in 1768 and died in 1851. He was a classic scholar. He was the first one in the United States. He established 2 schools in Frankfurt. One was the Academy, and one of the historical highlights of that is that one of his students was the future president Zachary Taylor. His son Theodore is very famous. He wrote the poem The Bivouac of the Dead, which commemorated the Kentuckians killed in Mexico in 1847. Father Koopmans is the only priest buried here at St. Francis Cemetery. He's from the Netherlands. He was born in 1834 and died in 1864. He was pastor here at St. Francis from 1863 to 1864. Cecilia Weisenberger, she was from Germany. She was born in 1829 and died in 1891. You might recognize the name Weisenberger. Her husband, August Weisenberger, founded the Weisenberger Mill over near Midway.
Nothing that I can think of. Is there anything else we should have touched on?
The renovation process, it was long, a little longer than we expected, but it was only because we found more work needed done than we expected. One of the interesting things, you look at these nice columns here, those are just outer coverings. Underneath, you see hand-hewn columns, or hand-hewn logs. And under the floor, before the renovation, they basically leveled the church with old logs and stones. And we still have some of the stones holding it up here, but we did get rid of the logs under here because it was beyond unsafe. And the building techniques have changed quite a bit during 200 years as well. But when you take off the boards, you can still see the original craftsmanship. Going up into the ceiling, you can see some graffiti from people who worked on the church earlier in history. And you can see hand-hewn beams. I mean, the 2x4s, 2x6s were real 2x4s, real 2x6s. And the nails were handmade. All the bricks for the church were fired on this property, too. So the history is quite a history in terms of the building itself. And the history of the people and the events here are really quite amazing as well.
Thank you all for watching.